The fear. Before the fire, the wind howled across the battlefield of Yharn, carrying with it the smell of burning metal and scorched soil. Smoke curled through the shattered remains of buildings, and the ground trembled with every distant explosion. Inside a dark trench, hundreds of alien soldiers waited, their bodies tense, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the human army stood like shadows in the fog. Commander Rhel of the Carthan Legion gripped his plasma rifle tighter. He had fought, on many worlds, faced beasts that could swallow tanks whole, and seen sons die in the void. Yet, tonight, something inside him felt heavier than ever. Fear. It was not the kind born from the thought of dying. It was the kind that came when a warrior sensed he was facing something he could not understand. Rhel's second-in-command, Lieutenant. Saren crouched beside him, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Commander, the humans are advancing again. They should have fallen back hours ago. Their losses are catastrophic." Rhel's jaw clenched. "And yet they come," he said quietly. Through the lens of his visor, he could see them. Humans in torn armor, limping, bleeding, but still walking forward. Their faces were unreadable, their eyes bright with something that wasn't madness or hatred. It was determination. "They don't fear death," Saren whispered. "Why?" Rhel didn't answer. In truth, he didn't know. He had studied their tactics, their weapons, even their biology. They were fragile creatures, soft skin, short lifespan, limited strength compared to Carthans, and yet they fought as if pain was a stranger to them. The trenches shook again as a barrage of human mortars struck the ridge. One of the alien soldiers screamed, clutching his burnt arm. Rhel turned to shout an order when he saw something through the smoke. A human medic dragging a wounded soldier across open ground. Plasma bolts rained down, one grazing his leg, another burning into his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He kept crawling, pulling his comrade behind him. The two collapsed near a broken wall, both bleeding heavily. "Why doesn't he run?" one alien muttered, wide-eyed. "He's dying." Rhel stared, saying nothing. The human medic looked down at his friend, pressed his hand over the wound, and, despite his own agony, smiled. That smile froze Rhel's mind. It wasn't madness. It was peace. The medic looked up once, towards the Carthan line, and for a moment Rhel felt those human eyes pierce through the smoke, through the fear, straight into his soul. Then the medic fell still. His hand, once steady, slipped from his friend's chest. No one in the alien trench spoke for several seconds. The silence was louder than the battle itself. Saren swallowed hard. He smiled, while dying. Rhel's throat felt dry. "Because he believed it meant something," he murmured. "What could mean something in this slaughter?" Saren asked. "Something we've forgotten," Rhel replied, his voice distant. Above them, the sky cracked open again as human aircraft streaked overhead, dropping waves of blue fire on alien artillery. Even as the sky burned, the humans advanced through the flames. Their communication channels intercepted by alien sensors, filled with strange words. For them, hold the line. We're not done yet. Not once did they mention fear. In the alien command post, distant from the front lines, the generals barked orders. "Hold your position. Humans are just animals. They don't think, they only charge." But the soldiers in the trenches could see it. The humans did not move. Like beasts, they moved like people who had already made peace with death. As the hours passed, the alien soldiers' courage began to wither. Every time a human fell, two more took his place. Their songs echoed faintly in the distance, low, deep melodies that seemed to reach beyond pain and into something eternal. By midnight, Rhel's troops were exhausted. The ammunition was running low. Fear was everywhere. But then, through the static of the comms, a human voice came through the translator frequency. It was cracked, weak, but steady. "We're not afraid of dying, only of dying for nothing." The alien soldiers froze. They had expected taunts or threats, not that calm truth. Even Rhel's claws trembled slightly as he listened. The words hit harder than any bullet. He rose slowly, peering once more over the trench's edge. The battlefield glowed orange from fires. Through the haze, the human line advanced again. Slow, silent, unstoppable. One human carried a flag made from torn fabric, its edges still burning. It was not a flag of conquest. It was a message. Rhel felt something shift deep inside him, something that had been buried under years of war and obedience. He turned to Saren. "Do you feel it?" She nodded weakly. "Yes, and I hate it. It feels like respect." Rhel exhaled, staring at the human flag swaying in the wind. "Then remember this night," he said quietly. "Because before this, war ends. Every soldier in this galaxy will learn what it truly means to face death." The flames rose higher, painting the sky crimson, and in that crimson light, the humans kept walking, tired, broken, bleeding, but never afraid. For the first time in his long military life, Commander Rhel feared not death itself, but the courage of those who no longer feared it. The unbroken line. The next morning rose with a pale and distant light, filtered through the ash-filled sky. The battlefield was silent except for the low crackle of burning debris and the groans of machines half buried in the dirt. Commander Rhel stood at the edge of the trench, staring at what remained of the human front line. He had expected them to retreat in the night, but they had not moved an inch. Their bodies, some still standing even in death, formed a grim silhouette against the smoldering horizon. Yet, among the fallen, new figures appeared from the haze, walking calmly through the destruction. They were human reinforcements, not many, just a few dozen, but they walked like giants in the morning fog. Rhel watched in disbelief as one of them, a tall man in a torn uniform, stepped onto the ridge and planted a broken metal pole into the ground. It was not a weapon, not a banner, just a piece of twisted iron with a tattered cloth tied to it. He raised his arm and shouted something in his own tongue. The translator whispered the words in Rhel's ear. "We're still here." That single line, simple and raw, echoed across the field like thunder. The alien soldiers inside the trench froze. Even Saren, who had never flinched under fire, found her breath shaking. Those words carried no rage, no threat, just truth. Rhel felt the weight of that truth pressing against his chest. Humans were not supposed to stand after such loss. They were supposed to break, to run, to surrender. Yet here they were, covered in blood and ash, laughing quietly among themselves as they prepared new weapons, patched their wounds, and shared water from dented canteens. There was no speech, no command. It was as if every one of them already knew what to do. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes calm, unblinking, as if the fear of death had been burned out of them long ago. "They are impossible," muttered one alien sniper beside Rhel. "They don't stop." Rhel's eyes narrowed. "They are not impossible," he said slowly. "They are human." He turned to the rest of his soldiers who were trembling behind the trench walls. "Do you know why they stand?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "Because they fight for something we have forgotten. They fight for each other." His words made some of the younger soldiers look up, confused, but most avoided his gaze. To them it sounded like madness, to admire the enemy in the middle of war. Suddenly, a human shell landed nearby, shaking the earth. The shockwave threw dust and bodies into the air. Screams filled the trench and panic spread like wildfire. But through the chaos, Rhel remained still, his eyes fixed on the humans marching. Through the fire, their armor glowing from the heat, their shadows long and unbroken. He realized then that humans had turned fear into fuel. Every death made them stronger. Every loss gave them a reason to keep moving. Above the noise, Rhel heard something strange. It was faint at first, then clearer. A rhythm, a chant, deep and steady, rolling across the smoke-filled valley. The human soldiers were singing. It wasn't a song of triumph, it was a song of remembrance, soft and haunting, yet it carried power. Even across enemy lines, the aliens could hear the words translated through broken radio frequencies. We carry their names. We carry their fire. Saren's hands shook as she listened. Why do they sing, Commander? They're surrounded. Rhel closed his eyes briefly. Because they know they are not alone, he said quietly. Every voice that falls joins their song. Hours passed, and the alien morale began to crack. Soldiers refused to climb out of the trenches. Some whispered that the humans were cursed, that death followed them but never claimed them. Others said the humans were already dead and fighting as ghosts. Only Rhel knew the truth. The humans were alive in a way his kind had forgotten how to be. By midday, the humans launched another charge. It wasn't organized, not by any general's plan. It was raw willpower, born from something deeper than tactics. They ran through the open field under heavy fire, and yet not one of them turned back. Plasma bolts tore through armor, explosions split the earth, but the line did not break. Every time a soldier fell, another filled the gap without hesitation. They didn't fight like soldiers, they fought like believers defending something sacred. Saren gasped as one human, badly wounded, fell to his knees, yet kept firing until his weapon melted in his hands. When his ammo ran out, he crawled forward, picking up a fallen comrade's gun. Even when struck again, he didn't stop. He collapsed only after the enemy gunfire finally ceased. The aliens stared in horror and awe. It was not their victory. It was exposure to something greater than survival itself. Rhel's claws dug into the trench wall. "Do you see, Saren?" he said softly. "They do not fight against death, they fight beside it. That's why we can't defeat them. Death is their oldest ally." That night, as darkness swallowed the battlefield once more, the alien trenches were filled not with triumph, but silence. The humans still held their ground, faint lights flickering in the distance as they tended to their wounded and spoke quietly around the fires. Rhel stood in the cold air, unable to look away. For the first time in his life, he envied the enemy. Not for their weapons, not for their victories, but for their spirit. He whispered into the dark, his voice barely audible. "If fear is the chain that binds us, then perhaps these humans have already broken free." The night wind carried his words away, blending with the faint echo of human laughter drifting through the smoke. And somewhere deep in his heart, the alien commander knew that the war was no longer about land or power. It was about the meaning of courage itself, the message in the smoke. By the third day of fighting, the battlefield had become a graveyard of silence and smoke. The air was thick, not only with dust and ash, but with the weight of something deeper, something unseen yet heavy enough to crush even the hardest hearts. The alien soldiers no longer shouted or celebrated small victories. They whispered, glancing at the distant human lines that still stood unbroken, scarred, and eerily calm. Commander Rhel walked through the wreckage of his own camp, the metallic stench of blood and fuel mixing in the wind. Everywhere he looked, his soldiers were exhausted, not just in body but in spirit. He could feel their fear, not of dying, but of living another day knowing that humans faced the same terror and somehow smiled through it. As night crept in, the sky above Yharn glowed faintly blue from the twin moons. A thick fog rolled over the battlefield, swallowing the broken machines and fallen bodies. In the distance, a sudden light pierced through the smoke, a bright flare, then another, and another, until there were dozens burning in a perfect circle. The alien scouts aimed their scanners, confusion spreading across the comms. "Commander," one of them called, "the humans are lighting fires." In formation. The data came through Rhel's visor. Yes, it was true. They had formed a glowing ring across the ruins, bright enough to be seen from orbit. Rhel narrowed his eyes, studying the strange display. "They're sending a message," he muttered. Within minutes, their communication systems began picking up an open human transmission. It wasn't encrypted, wasn't hidden. Every species within range could hear it, and every alien on the field froze as the translator rendered the words into their language. The voice that spoke was calm, cracked with fatigue, yet carried a steady strength that cut through the night. "If we fall, tell our families we smiled." The words repeated once, then the signal fell silent. Rhel stood completely still, the soft hum of machinery fading into nothingness around him. His troops looked at each other in disbelief, unsure if they had heard correctly. Even Saren, who stood beside him, blinked rapidly, as if her mind refused to process the meaning. "They're smiling. While dying," she whispered. Rhel turned to her slowly, his face lit by the flickering light of distant fires. "They are not fighting for victory," he said quietly. "They are fighting for meaning." The phrase lingered in the air like sacred scripture. Around them, the alien soldiers began to lower their weapons. A few even stepped closer to the ridge, watching the glowing circle of human lights in awe. It was beautiful and haunting at the same time, those tiny flames in the darkness, burning as symbols of defiance, of acceptance, of life that refused to be crushed by fear. A communications officer's voice broke through the silence. "Commander, should we attack now? Their formation is exposed." But Rhel didn't answer. He stared at the horizon where the flares flickered like stars on the ground. "If we attack now," he said finally, "we would destroy the only thing left in this war that still feels alive." His words confused his subordinates, yet no one dared to question him. Deep inside, every soldier felt the same uneasy pull. They had come to destroy humanity, but somehow it was their own hearts that were breaking. The night stretched on, and strange whispers spread through the alien camps. Some said the humans were performing a farewell ritual, preparing their souls for whatever awaited them beyond death. Others claimed it was a signal of surrender. But Rhel knew better. He could see it clearly. The humans were not surrendering to anyone. They were simply acknowledging the inevitable and choosing to face it on their own terms. Hours passed, and the battlefield remained still. Then, faintly, a human voice rose through the static again, broken by static yet unmistakable in tone. "We die so that others may live without fear." That simple sentence ignited something deep within the alien ranks. A few soldiers fell to their knees, others turned away, unable to watch. Rhel closed his eyes and whispered, "So this is why they smile. It's not courage. They've made peace with death itself." He felt something warm burn behind his eyes, something that felt dangerously close to admiration. Saren looked at him, her voice trembling. "Commander, if we fought for something like that, could we be like them?" Rhel didn't answer right away. He lifted his gaze toward the faint blue glow of the human fires. "Maybe," he said at last. "But before that, we must stop fearing what we do not understand." His voice hardened. "Fear is the true enemy here, not humans." At that moment, the ground trembled as thunder rolled from the distance. A new human dropship was landing near the ridge, its hull scorched, engines damaged, yet it came down steadily. Rhel's scanners showed no weapons, only medics and volunteers rushing out to tend to both human and alien wounded alike. The aliens in the trench gasped in disbelief. "They're helping our injured, too," one soldier murmured, his voice shaking. Rhel's gaze softened as he watched the small figures in the distance move carefully between the bodies, wrapping wounds, sharing water. There was no hatred, no pride, only compassion. For the first time, Rhel felt the crushing weight of his own species' arrogance. All his life he had been taught that fear kept soldiers loyal and strong. But now, watching the humans work under fire, he realized that love for life, for others, for purpose, was far more powerful than fear could ever be. As the fog thickened and dawn began to rise behind the smoke, the alien commander whispered to himself, "Perhaps it was never death that made us weak. It was the way we lived fearing it." He stood tall, his armor cracked and stained, and looked toward the human lights one last time before walking back into the mist. Behind him, whispers grew louder among his men, words carried like a spark from one heart to another. They no longer feared death because they had seen how humans faced it, with open eyes, steady hearts, and a smile that turned darkness into meaning. The human within, The dawn after the flare night was quiet but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made every sound heavier. The crunch of boots on broken glass, the faint hum of distant engines, the soft groan of the wounded carried through the smoky air. Commander Rhel moved carefully through the wreckage of the field, his armor scorched and cracked, his heart heavier than he wanted to admit. Around him, the once proud Carthan soldiers walked in silence, their eyes unfocused. They had seen death before, they had caused it 1,000 times, but never had they watched someone embrace it with a smile. That image, the human medic's calm face in the flames, haunted every one of them like a ghost that refused to fade. Rhel stopped when he noticed movement among the rubble. A faint sound, a weak cough almost drowned by the wind. He followed it past the charred hull of a transport ship and found a human soldier lying half-buried under a piece of collapsed metal. The man was young, no more than 20, with pale skin covered in burns and a patch of soot across his cheek. In his hand, he still clutched something small, a photograph. Rhel bent down, brushing away the dirt and debris. The picture showed a little girl smiling, her arms wrapped around a dog. The edges were burned, but the faces were still visible. For a long moment, Rhel just stared at it. The soldier's lips moved, a whisper escaping. "Please, don't let fear control you." Rhel froze, his eyes widening. The translator confirmed the words, and they hit harder than any explosion. Those were not the words of a conqueror or a fanatic. They were a message, one that seemed meant for him. "Don't let fear control you." The human's chest rose weakly one last time, and then it stopped. The photo slipped from his fingers, landing softly on the ground. For a long time, Rhel didn't move. Around him, the battle had ended for the moment. The guns quiet. He could hear the crackling of distant fires and the faint cries of the dying. He looked at the photo again, then at the body beside it, and something inside him broke open. All his life he had been taught that fear was strength, that a soldier's loyalty was forged through it, that courage was obedience, that victory meant survival. But this human had shown him something far greater, that true courage was born from love, not fear. Rhel lifted the body carefully and carried it through the ruins. His soldiers stared as their commander returned with the corpse of the enemy in his arms. Some looked away in shame, others whispered, unable to understand what they were seeing. Saren met him halfway, her voice trembling. "Commander, what are you doing?" He stopped in front of her, the weight of the human's body still in his hands. "He saved one of ours before he died." Rhel lied softly, though he knew the truth didn't need words. "He deserves the same respect we give our own." Saren looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Without speaking, she knelt beside him as he laid the human down on a patch of scorched earth. Together they covered the body with a torn, alien cloak. Rhel placed the photograph on top of the mound, his claws pressing it gently into the dirt. The small act sent a wave of emotion through the soldiers who had gathered nearby. None spoke, but all watched as their commander, a warrior known for his ruthlessness, bowed his head in silence for a fallen enemy. When Rhel finally stood, the air felt different. The smoke seemed thinner, the noise softer. He turned to his soldiers, his voice low but steady. "We have been fighting shadows," he said. "Not these humans, but the fear they reflect in us. We've become slaves to it. But look at them. They're free, even in death." His words spread through the ranks like quiet fire. No one cheered, no one clapped. But something changed in their eyes. The fear that had clung to them like a shroud began to fade, replaced by something else. A spark of understanding, or maybe envy. That night, as darkness covered the valley once more, Rhel sat alone beside the makeshift grave. He could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the human's face and heard those final words echoing in his mind. "Don't let fear control you." He thought of the human families waiting on distant worlds, of the children who might never see their parents again. And yet somehow those humans still smiled when facing death. What kind of strength could grow from such fragile hearts? When the message came from High Command ordering a renewed assault, Rhel ignored it. He no longer believed in victory by destruction. His communications officer hesitated, unsure of what to do. "Commander," she said softly, "if we refuse, we will be seen as traitors." Rhel looked up, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of dying fires. "Then let them call us traitors," he said. "Better a traitor to fear than a slave to it." He rose to his feet and gazed out across the battlefield. The humans' fires still flickered faintly in the distance, unbroken, unwavering. And, in that fragile glow, Rhel saw something beautiful, something that made the chaos of the universe suddenly make sense. Humans did not fight because they hated death. They fought because they loved life. That love, fierce and unyielding, was their greatest weapon. As the wind carried ashes across the valley, Rhel whispered to the night, "If this is what it means to be human, then maybe it's time we remember what it means to be alive." The words vanished into the wind, but somewhere beyond the smoke a single human flare rose once more, lighting the dark sky. And in that light, for the first time, Commander Rhel felt hope. The fire of truth. The fourth sunrise on Yharn was unlike any before it. The air was strangely still, heavy with the smell of wet ash after the night's brief rain. The battlefield, once a place of endless thunder and flame, now looked like a vast graveyard where the earth itself seemed to mourn. Craters had become shallow pools that reflected the pale light of the twin suns, and smoke rose lazily from the broken skeletons of machines scattered across the plain. Commander Rhel walked among the ruins, his armor dull and scarred, his weapon holstered. Behind him followed a quiet column of alien soldiers, not in battle formation, but in something closer to reverence. None spoke, for none could find words to match what they had seen or what they now felt inside. Far ahead, across the muddy field, the human survivors moved with the same strange purpose they had shown since the beginning of this war. They were few now, perhaps 100 where once there had been thousands, yet they worked as if untouched by despair. Rhel watched them dig shallow graves with their bare hands, lifting both human and alien bodies into the earth. There was no anger in their faces, no hatred in their gestures. They buried enemies beside friends, marking each grave with the same small stone and the same quiet prayer. It was not victory that guided them. It was dignity. Rhel stood frozen, realizing that these fragile creatures had done something that no empire, no weapon, no doctrine had ever achieved. They had made death itself gentle. When the order came from high command to resume the assault, Rhel ignored it. His officers exchanged uncertain glances, afraid to speak. Saren stepped forward, her voice breaking the long silence. "Commander," she said softly, "the High Council demands progress. They will call us cowards if we do nothing." Rhel turned to her slowly, his eyes darker than the smoke around them. "Then let them," he replied. "Let them call us what they want. I will not burn meaning from this ground to please their pride." His soldiers shifted uneasily, glancing at each other, but none dared to move. The commander's defiance was dangerous, it bordered on treason, but his conviction carried a weight that made argument impossible. With calm precision, Rhel stepped away from his trench and began to walk across the field. The humans saw him almost immediately, but no weapon was raised. His soldiers gasped behind him, thinking their commander had lost his mind. But Rhel kept walking, the wind tugging at his cloak, his steps slow yet certain. He carried something in his hands, a small bundle wrapped in gray fabric. When he reached the middle of the field, where the air was thick with the smell of fuel and blood, he knelt down and placed the bundle gently on the ground. As he unfolded the fabric, the soldiers, watching through their scopes, saw what it contained: the body of the human he had found the day before. Rhel stood and raised his arms slightly, not in surrender, but in offering. "He deserves rest," he said aloud, his translator carrying the words in broken human language. The humans on the opposite ridge hesitated. Then, one by one, they lowered their weapons. A few of them began walking down the slope, moving carefully, cautiously. Among them was a medic with his arm in a sling, his face covered in soot. When they reached Rhel, no one spoke. The alien commander simply stepped aside and let them take the fallen man. For the first time in this long war, the two species stood together, not as enemies, but as survivors of the same suffering. Behind Rhel, his own soldiers had gathered at the trench line, watching in stunned silence. They had been taught that humans were savage, reckless, incapable of reason. Yet now they saw their leader standing beside them like equals, and the humans treating even their dead with kindness. Something broke inside the Carthan ranks, a wall of lies, centuries old, crumbling beneath the weight of truth. That moment spread like wildfire through the communication networks of both armies. Every drone, every camera, every broadcast captured the sight of the alien commander and the human medic standing side by side among the graves. Soldiers across distant sectors watched in disbelief. In one night, Rhel's single act of compassion shattered the image of the enemy that propaganda had built for generations. Back at the alien capital, the High Council's command room erupted in fury. The generals screamed treason, demanding that Rhel be executed immediately for dishonoring his oath. But the signal was already out, streaming across colonies and outposts, watched by billions. They saw no traitor. They saw a soldier who had remembered what it meant to be alive. Rhel turned to his soldiers and spoke, his voice low but filled with steady power. "We have spent lifetimes killing in the name of fear," he said. "And for what? To stand here in the ashes of our own souls? Look at them, humans, dying yet unbroken. They taught us that honor is not found in obedience, but in mercy." He paused, letting his words settle into the silence that followed. "We came to this world to conquer them. Instead, they conquered what was left of our hearts." For a moment, no one moved. Then, to Rhel's astonishment, one of his younger soldiers stepped forward, removed his helmet, and placed it on the ground, a silent sign of respect. Another followed, and then another, until the entire trench line stood bareheaded, bowing quietly toward the field. On the opposite side, the human troops did the same. There were no banners, no anthems, only a shared stillness that spoke louder than any weapon. That night, fires were lit across both camps, not for war, but for remembrance. The flames burned high, bright against the endless dark sky. Humans and aliens sat in their separate camps, staring into the same firelight, feeling the same fragile warmth of something new being born in the ashes, understanding. And though the war would rage elsewhere for many months to come, here on Yharn it ended quietly, not with victory or surrender, but with a simple act of truth. An alien who carried a fallen human and a battlefield that refused to burn any longer. As Rhel watched the flames flicker, he whispered into the wind. The war was never against them. It was against what we feared within ourselves. And when he looked toward the horizon, where the human campfires glowed like distant stars, he knew that no matter what happened next, something greater had already begun. The slow, quiet birth of peace in the heart of a soldier who had finally learned to feel. The awakening, the message of Yharn, did not stay buried in the mud and ash. It spread like a whisper carried on solar winds, passing from outpost to outpost, from ship to ship, from one frightened soldier to another until it became something greater. A question: what truly made one strong? The empire that had ruled with iron claws for centuries began to tremble under that single question. Commander Rhel's image, standing in the rain beside a human medic, was replayed across thousands of worlds. The High Council tried to censor it, labeling him a traitor, claiming that he had been corrupted by human lies. But it was too late. The soldiers had seen it with their own eyes. They had seen kindness on a battlefield and mercy where there should have been hatred. The truth had burned its way into their hearts like a second sunrise that no darkness could hide. In the weeks that followed, Rhel and his unit were summoned back to the capital city of Veklar Prime. The great towers of the Empire rose above a sea of lights, cold and magnificent, but to Rhel they felt hollow now. He walked through the grand halls where once he had felt pride, and now all he felt was distance. His soldiers were disarmed and separated. Whispers followed them wherever they went. The air was heavy with accusation. The High Council sat upon their elevated thrones, cloaked in shadow, their eyes burning with controlled fury. "Commander Rhel," the eldest among them began, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. "You are charged with disobedience, fraternizing with the enemy, and spreading weakness among your troops. How do you plead?" Rhel stood tall, his armor cleaned but still scarred, a reminder of the truth that could not be polished away. "I plead guilty to only one thing," he said calmly, his voice steady, resonating through the chamber. "To seeing clearly?" Murmurs rippled through the gathered officials. The elder counselor leaned forward, his voice sharp. "And what did you see, Commander? Tell us, what madness did those humans infect you with?" Rhel took a slow breath and lifted his head. "I saw creatures who should have been terrified but were not. I saw beings who bled and burned like us but still smiled in the face of death. I saw strength without cruelty, courage without command, and love without reason. I saw life as it was meant to be lived." The hall fell silent. For the first time in centuries, no one spoke back to defiance. The counselor sneered, breaking the quiet. "You disgrace your uniform. Fear keeps us strong, Rhel. It binds us, controls us, ensures survival. You would throw away generations of order for a delusion born of human emotion." Rhel's voice grew firmer. "Fear is not strength, it is a chain. We have been slaves to it so long we no longer recognize freedom when it stands before us. The humans have something we lost a long time ago, the courage to live without it." His words echoed long after the guards seized him. As they dragged him through the corridors, he did not resist. Outside, in the city streets, thousands had already gathered. Workers, soldiers, and civilians alike, all whispering his name. Many had seen the recordings of his act on Yharn. They had watched as he carried the fallen human and refused to fight. They had wept without knowing why. Now, seeing him bound in chains, they felt the stirrings of something dangerous. Empathy. When Rhel was locked in his cell, the night was long and heavy, but he found peace in the darkness. Through the narrow slit of the window, he could see the lights of the city far below, millions of glowing points stretching toward the horizon. Each one represented a life that had been living in fear, and he wondered how many of them had begun to question everything, just as he had. He thought of the human soldier's final words, "Don't let fear control you." They had followed him even here, echoing in the silence like a heartbeat. Days passed. The council made plans to execute Rhel publicly, hoping to crush any spark of rebellion. But the more they tried to suppress his story, the faster it spread. Soldiers began refusing to fire on human settlements. Captains ignored orders to bomb retreating ships. Small acts of defiance grew into something vast and unstoppable. Across the empire, murals appeared on walls, paintings of a human and an alien standing together under the twin moons of Yharn. When the day of the execution arrived, Rhel was brought to the central plaza of Veklar Prime. The crowd stretched as far as the eye could see. The counselors appeared on towering holographic screens, declaring justice in the name of fear and order. But as the executioner approached, a sound rose from the sea of onlookers, not shouts, not screams, but silence. A silence deeper than fear, filled with something new, resolve. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, a single voice called out, trembling but clear, "We are not afraid." Another voice joined, then another, until the words spread like fire through the square. "We are not afraid. We are not afraid." The guards hesitated. The executioner lowered his weapon. The council's holograms flickered as systems overloaded from the chaos of the growing chant. And in the center of it all, Rhel smiled, not in pride, but in peace. The humans had taught him that death was not the end, and now that truth had become unstoppable. That night, the prisons of the Empire burst open. Soldiers abandoned their posts. The council's ships fled into the void. For the first time in Carthan history, fear no longer ruled the people. Rhel's body vanished in the confusion. but legends claimed he was seen walking into the night, unarmed and unchained, his eyes lifted toward the stars. They said he sought the humans not as enemies or saviors, but as equals, to thank them for showing him what no empire ever could. And in the centuries that followed, when the story of Yharn was retold, the message remained the same, that courage was not born from power or domination, but from compassion, the quiet fire that no fear could extinguish. The legacy beyond death centuries past, and yet the world of Yharn never forgot. What had once been a place of fire and ash had become something entirely different, a living monument to the courage that changed two civilizations. Where the trenches had cut deep scars into the earth, gardens now bloomed. The air, once poisoned by smoke, carried the soft hum of life again. A great city stood where the final battle had taken place, its skyline rising like silver spears toward the twin suns. But at its heart stood something more important than any building, a monument of two colossal hands, one human and one alien, reaching for each other across a river of glass. The water beneath reflected their eternal grasp, shimmering like starlight in the morning breeze. Every visitor who came to this place, whether human, alien, or hybrid, walked in silence before the statue, because no words could describe what it represented. The great hall beside the monument held the archives of the fallen, a collection of voices, journals, and transmissions from both sides of the Yharn War. It was said that within those halls, one could still hear the last message broadcast by the human soldiers on that final night. "If we fall, tell our families we smiled." The words had become a creed that outlasted the empires that once ruled. They were carved into every academy, whispered by every young cadet before their first mission, and written on the walls of hospitals where soldiers were taught that mercy was strength, not weakness. Generations after Commander Rhel's disappearance, stories about him became myth. Some said he had been executed in secret by the remnants of the old High Council. Others believed he had fled beyond known space, seeking the descendants of the humans he once fought. But among those who studied his life, there was one truth that never faded. Rhel had ignited something far greater than rebellion. He had awakened empathy in a species that had forgotten how to feel. His name became a symbol not of defiance, but of transformation. Statues of him now stood in both human and alien worlds, always depicted without weapons, his hands open, as though inviting the universe to lay down its fear. In the schools of the new generation, history lessons about the Yharn War were not about conquest or strategy. They were about connection. Teachers spoke of the day the two armies stopped fighting to bury their dead together, of the alien commander who carried a fallen enemy across a field of ashes, of the humans who smiled into death and, by doing so, taught an empire how to live. For children who grew up under the twin suns, these were not stories of war. They were lessons of unity, of finding humanity not in species or blood, but in the heart's quiet defiance against fear. On the anniversary of the war's end, thousands would gather at the monument of the two hands. They came not just from Yharn, but from worlds scattered across the stars. Humans and aliens stood side by side, holding torches that shimmered blue and gold, the colors of both species' blood. Together they would walk in silence, retracing the old battlefield's path. The youngest among them would lead the march, carrying a banner stitched with ancient words. "Fear dies when humanity stands." It had become more than a motto. It was a way of life. One year, among the crowd, an elderly alien scholar named Terran stood quietly at the edge of the procession. In his trembling hands he held a small, ancient photo, a relic he had found decades earlier while researching the original battlefield. It was faded and worn, showing a smiling human girl with a small dog beside her. Terran had spent his life studying Rhel's journals, and though no one could prove it, he believed the photo once belonged to the human soldier Rhel had carried that day. As the torches flickered across his face, Terran lifted the photo to his heart and whispered, "You taught us how to be brave." That night, after the ceremony, the city's lights dimmed, and every building across Yharn went dark for one silent minute. a universal tradition of remembrance. In that minute of darkness, billions of eyes turned upward to the stars. Somewhere among them, they believed, was the spirit of Commander Rhel and the soldiers of that long-ago war, still watching, still guiding, still whispering to those who listened that the greatest victory was not survival, but compassion. Across the galaxy, countless civilizations who once mocked humanity's weakness now told stories of their strength. The phrase human spirit had taken on a meaning beyond species. It was used to describe any act of selflessness, any soul that chose hope over fear. When a colony faced disaster and strangers risked their lives to save each other, they said, they showed the human spirit. When a dying world refused to give up and built life from ashes, they said, human spirit burns there. It was not just a human thing anymore, it belonged to the stars themselves. And somewhere deep in the archives of Yharn, a recording remained, discovered long after even the monument's builders had turned to dust. It was faint and old, but still clear enough to hear a voice. The last words of Commander Rhel, recorded before his trial. In it, he said softly, "They smiled, and the universe changed." Those words became the closing line of every history text, every memorial, every prayer across worlds. The war that began in fear ended in awakening, and through the sacrifice of both sides, something eternal had been born. The monument's twin hands stood unbroken through centuries of storms, their reflection forever shimmering in the glass river below. Children still played at its base, laughing in every language the stars had ever known. The humans had not conquered the galaxy with weapons or power. They had conquered it with spirit. And long after empires faded and names were forgotten, that spirit remained, glowing quietly at the heart of creation, reminding all who gazed upon the monument that the greatest strength in the universe is not to fight death, but to face it with love, courage, and a smile.